911 call that exposed a killer's biggest mistake. It started with a phone call. A trembling voice dialed emergency services late one quiet evening. The caller sounded panicked, almost desperate. Please, please hurry. My wife is not breathing. The operator tried to calm the man on the line. She asked simple questions. Where was he? What happened? When did he last see her alive? But within a minute, something about the call began to feel wrong. There were small inconsistencies, odd pauses, details that didn't quite match the panic in his voice. At first, no one suspected that this frantic emergency call would become the single piece of evidence that would unravel a carefully hidden crime. Because what the caller didn't realize was that every word he spoke, every second of hesitation, every mistake in his story was being recorded. And that recording would later expose the biggest mistake a killer could ever make. This is the story of the 911 call that revealed the truth. A quiet neighborhood. The story takes place in a quiet, suburban neighborhood where life moved slowly and predictably. Tree-lined streets stretched past rows of comfortable homes. Children rode their bikes in the afternoons, and neighbors greeted each other with friendly waves. It was the kind of place where serious crime almost never happened. Among the families living there were Michael and Laura Bennett. From the outside, they seemed like the perfect couple. Michael worked as a financial consultant. Laura was a school counselor known for her kindness and calm personality. Friends described them as stable and successful. They had been married for nearly 8 years and shared a beautiful two-story home near the edge of the neighborhood. But behind the carefully maintained image of their life together, the relationship had quite begun to fracture. A marriage under pressure. Over the years, the pressures of work, finances, and personal expectations had slowly eroded the closeness between Michael and Laura. Arguments became more frequent. Small disagreements turned into long nights of silence. Friends noticed that Laura seemed more withdrawn in recent months. One coworker later told investigators that Laura had once mentioned feelings trapped in her marriage. But like many couples struggling privately, they continued to present a united front to the outside world. Neighbors still saw them attending barbecues together. Family photos still filled their social media pages. No one could see the tension growing beneath the surface. And no one could predict how quickly everything was about to change. The night everything changed. It was a quiet Thursday evening when the emergency call came in at 10:42 p.m. The dispatcher answered. The caller was Michael Bennett. His voice sounded shaky and breathless. My wife, she's on the floor. I think something's wrong. She won't wake up. The operator asked him to stay calm. Is she breathing? I don't know, Michael replied. The dispatcher instructed him to check the breathing and begin CPR if necessary. But several minutes, Michael stayed on the line while following the operator's instructions. But something about the call immediately struck the dispatcher as usual. as unusual. Most callers in true emergencies speak quickly, emotionally, sometimes categorically. Michael's voice, however, carried an odd rhythm. He paused frequently. Sometimes he seemed to be searching for the right words, and occasionally his tone shifted from panic to calm within seconds. At the time, the dispatcher couldn't explain why it felt strange, but the feeling lingered. The arrival of police and paramedics. Within minutes, emergency responders arrived at the Bennett home. Paramedics rushed inside. Laura Bennett was lying on the living room floor. She was unresponsive. After several attempts to revive her, the paramedics were forced to make a grim declaration. Laura Bennett was dead. Michael appeared devastated. He told officers that Laura had suddenly collapsed while they were watching televisions together. According to his story, he had rushed to call emergency services the moment he realized she wasn't breathing. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic medical emergency, but when detectives arrived and began examining the scene more carefully, a few troubling details emerged. The first suspicion. On the responding officers noticed faint bruising around Laura's neck. At first it was subtle, but the marks were enough to raise concern. If Laura had simply collapsed due to a medical condition, those bruises shouldn't be there. The medical examiner was called, and the investigation quickly shifted from a possible medical emergency to something far more serious. Laura Bennett's death was now being treated as a suspicious. Michael Bennett, the Kevin husband, suddenly became the most important witness. The investigation begins. Detectives begin by asking Michael to recount the events of the evening. He explained that the couple had been relaxing in the living room. Laura had complained about feeling dizzy. Then, according to Michael, she suddenly collapsed. He claimed he tried to wake up her before calling emergency services. At first, the story seemed plausible. But investigators heard something extremely important, that Michael couldn't control the recording of the 911 call. And as detectives begin reviewing the recording more carefully, subtle contradictions begin to appear. The recording. Detectives listened to the 911 call again and again. At first, nothing seemed obviously incriminating, but experienced investigators know that emergency calls often reveal far more than callers realize. People in genuine emergencies behave differently from those trying to stage one. When panic is real, reactions are spontaneous and emotional. When panic is staged, people often focus too much on sounding convincing. And in Michael's call, several moments raise questions. For example, when the dispatcher asked how long Laura had been unconscious, Michael hesitated for nearly 5 seconds before answering. Then he gave a vague response. I think maybe a minute. But investigators knew something important. Medical evidence suggests Laura had likely been dead much longer than that. The inconsistencies grow. Another detail caught investigators' attention. During the call, the dispatcher repeatedly asked Michael to place the phone down so he could perform CPR more effectively. But Michael kept the phone in his hand. The recording captured his breathing, his movements, even faint background sounds. At one point, he claimed to be performing chest compressions, But the audio didn't match with CPR usually sounds like. There were no heavy movement, no rhythm, no sound of exertion. It was as he was pretending. Investigators begin to suspect that Michael's emergency call might not be what it seemed. The auto spy. Meanwhile, the medical examiner completed Bennett's auto spy. The findings changed everything. Laura had not died from a medical condition. She had been strange. The bruising on her neck confirmed it. More importantly, the estimated time of death suggested she had been killed at least an hour before the 911 call was placed. That meant Michael's story could not be, possibly be true. The man who called the emergency services claiming his wife had suddenly collapsed had likely been in the house with her body for over an hour before dialing the phone. The investigation had officially become a homicide case, and Michael Bennett was now the prime suspect. The interrogation. Detectives invited Michael to the station for questioning. At first, they continued repeating the same story. Laura had collapsed. He had panicked. He had called for help. But investigators slowly began presenting the evidence. First, the medical findings. Then the inconsistencies in the 911 call. Michael's confidence began to crumble. He grew defensive. His explanations became less clear. At one point, detectives asked him directly, "Why did you wait so long to call for help?" Michael hesitated. The silence stretched across the room, and for the first time, investigators saw the fear in his eyes. The breaking point. And the interrogation continued. Detectives revealed another piece of evidence. Neighbors had reported hearing loud arguing earlier that evening. Voices raised in anger, a door slamming. The arguments had occurred nearly an hour before the 911 call. The timeline now made sense. Michael and Laura had fought. Something violent had happened. And Michael had spent nearly an hour deciding what to do before calling emergency services. The room grew quiet. Then Michael spoke, and his story began to change. The truth. According to Michael's new version of events, the couple had argued about finances and the future of their marriage. The argument escalated quickly. Laura accused him to hiding money. Michael claimed she treated to leave him. Tempers rose. Voices grew louder. And then, in a moment, Michael later described as losing control. He grabbed Laura by the shoulders. She fought back. The struggle lasted only seconds. But in the moment of rage, Michael wrapped his hands around her neck. When Laura stopped moving, panic set in. Michael realized what he had done. But instead of calling for help immediately, he spent nearly an hour trying to figure out how to explain it. Finally, he decided to stage the emergency call. But he made one critical mistake. He underestimated the power of that recording. The evidence that sealed his fate. During the trial, prosecutors played the 911 call for the jury. Experts explained the unusual pauses, the lack of genuine CPR sounds, the delayed response times. Each small detail painted a clear picture. The call wasn't the desperate play of a grieving husband. It was the carefully staged performance of someone trying to hide a crime. And it was the mistake that ultimately destroyed Michael Bennett's defense. The verdict. After several days of testimony, the jury reached its decision. Michael Bennett was found guilty of second-degree murder. The court sentenced him to decades in prison. A quiet suburban neighborhood had lost one of its residents, and a single recorded phone call had revealed the truth behind the crime. Closing reflection. In many criminal cases, investigators rely on physical evidence, DNA, fingerprints, surveillance footage. But sometimes the most powerful evidence is something far simpler: a voice, a phone call, a moment when someone believes they are controlling the story, but unknowingly reveals everything. Michael Bennett thought he could hide his crime behind a desperate plea for help. Instead, the very call meant to protect him became the piece of evidence that exposed him. And it serves as a chilling reminder that in the world of criminal investigations, even the smallest mistake can uncover the truth, because sometimes the most dangerous evidence a killer leaves behind is their own voice. Thank you so much to hear this story, and thank you so much to see this video.